Red Rock was once a town of opportunity, its dusty streets bustling with fortune seekers, chasing the promise of gold and silver veins running rich through the nearby mountains. Now those same streets lay eerily quiet, shadowed by fear instead of hope. The clanging of pickaxes still echoed from the mines, but the miners' faces were drawn, their eyes downcast, shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. This wasn't the burden of hard labor. It was the crushing pressure of living under Sheriff Malachai Slade's boot heel. Sheriff Slade stood on the porch of his office, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, eyes narrowed against the Arizona sun. He wasn't what you'd call an imposing figure, medium height, lean build, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the permanent sneer that twisted his lips. The tin star, pinned to his chest, gleamed in the sunlight, a mockery of the badge's true purpose. Behind him stood 4 deputies, each one meaner than the last, hands never straying far from their holsters.
"Tax collection day,"
Slade announced, his voice carrying across the town square.
"Don't make us come looking for you."
The townspeople scurried like mice, disappearing into shops and homes. All except for one, Samuel Wilson, the town blacksmith, stood firm outside his forge, massive arms crossed over his chest, hammer still clutched in one hand.
"I paid last week, Slade,"
Wilson called out, his deep voice steady despite the danger crackling in the air.
"And the week before that. There's nothing left to give."
A hush fell over Red Rock. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Slade's eyes narrowed. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and 2 deputies immediately flanked the blacksmith, while a third approached from behind.
"Seems Wilson here needs a reminder about civic duty,"
Slade drawled, stepping down into the dusty street. What happened next would haunt Red Rock for months. The deputies dragged Wilson into the center of town, forcing him to his knees. Slade circled him slowly, lecturing about respect for the law while delivering calculated blows with a wooden baton. The blacksmith, proud and strong, didn't cry out, not until the 4th strike shattered his right elbow, ensuring he'd never hold a hammer properly again. From the shadows of the general store, a young woman named Martha Ellis watched with tears streaming down her face. When night fell, she slipped out of town on her father's fastest horse, carrying 3 letters addressed to men whose names were whispered like legends in these parts: Shaw, Kane, and Grady, former marshals who once rode together, bringing justice to the lawless territories when no one else could. Red Rock's desperate plea for salvation was racing across the desert, carried by a woman who knew that if help didn't come soon, there would be nothing left worth saving. If you think this is bad, you won't believe who rides in next. Tell me, have you ever lived in a town where everyone lived in fear of those meant to protect them? Edit. 60 miles east of Red Rock, Elias Shaw woke before dawn, just as he had every day for the past 5 years. His weathered hands moved automatically, lighting the lantern beside his modest bed in the farmhouse he'd built with those same hands. The flickering light illuminated walls adorned with only 2 decorations, a faded U.S. Marshal's badge and a wanted poster so old its edges had begun to yellow. The face on that poster, younger, less scarred, belonged to Malachai Slade. Shaw's morning routine was interrupted by an urgent knock. Opening the door, he found a breathless, dust-covered Martha Ellis extending a sealed letter. "Red Rock needs you, Marshal," she gasped. "Slade's become the devil himself." 200 miles south in a small border town, Jonah the preacher Kane finished his sermon to a congregation of 12 faithful souls. His church was nothing more than a converted barn, but the words he preached carried the weight of absolute conviction. Few who saw him in his worn black coat with Bible in hand would guess that beneath the same coat rested a cult peacemaker, or that the same fingers that gently turned pages of Scripture could fan a hammer with deadly precision. As his congregation departed, a rider approached, handing Kane an identical letter. The preacher's face darkened as he read, memories of a church engulfed in flames and Slade's mocking laughter flooding back. "The Lord's work calls me elsewhere," he told his flock, already reaching for his saddlebags. Meanwhile, deep in the wilderness of the Superstition Mountains, Harlan Grady skinned a rabbit outside his solitary cabin. No man alive could track better than Grady. Part Apache on his mother's side, he moved through the land like a ghost, reading the desert's secrets as clearly as words on a page. His quiet existence, chosen after burying his younger brother, Slade's handiwork, was shattered by Martha's final delivery. Grady's face remained impassive as he read, but his eyes, gray as storm clouds, flashed with something long dormant. Without a word, he extinguished his fire, packed his few possessions, and whistled for his horse. 3 days later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, 3 riders approached an abandoned stagecoach outpost 20 miles outside of Red Rock. They arrived from different directions but dismounted as one, their movements betraying a familiarity that transcended their years apart. Shaw, his silver hair cropped short beneath his hat, nodded curtly to his former companions. Kane removed his black hat, revealing a face that had grown more lined but no less determined. Grady simply stood, saying nothing, his silence as familiar to the others as their own voices. 5 years, Shaw finally said, extending his hand to each man in turn. Hoped our paths wouldn't cross again under these circumstances. Kane's deep voice rumbled. The good book says there's a time for peace and a time for war. Slade's brought war to innocent people. Grady removed a folded piece of paper from his jacket, a crude map of Red Rock. Town's grown since we last rode through. More mines, more money, more for Slade to steal. As night fell completely, the 3 men gathered around a small fire, sharing whiskey and memories, both bitter and sweet. By midnight, they had formed a plan. By dawn, they had renewed a blood oath made years before. Red Rock would be free, or they would die trying. Life in Red Rock had deteriorated into a daily struggle for survival. The once thriving mining town now existed solely to fill Sheriff Slade's coffers. Each Monday, miners trudged up from the deep shafts, their faces streaked with dirt and despair as Slade's men waited to claim half their earnings as town tax. Storekeepers kept ledgers with 2 columns, one for their business, one for Slade's protection fees. Those who couldn't pay found their shops mysteriously burned to the ground the next day. Samuel Wilson, the blacksmith, sat outside his forge, right arm bound in a crude sling, staring blankly at tools he could no longer use. His apprentice worked the bellows while trying to follow Wilson's hoarse instructions. The beating had been meant as a message, one that every citizen of Red Rock had received loud and clear. "Keep working," Virgil Cobb barked as he strode past the forge. Cobb, Slade's second in command, was tall and rail-thin, with a face like a hatchet and eyes cold as river stones. Where Slade employed calculation, Cobb simply used cruelty. He enjoyed inflicting pain, and everyone knew it. "Yes, sir," Wilson muttered, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Cobb paused, then continued his patrol, hand resting on the ivory-handled revolver at his hip. Inside the small stone church at the edge of town, Father O'Reilly, a white-haired Irishman who'd seen too many winters and too much suffering, lit candles at the altar. Martha Ellis slipped through the door, her eyes darting nervously. "Did you find them, child?" the priest whispered, his weathered hands steadying her trembling ones. "All 3, she confirmed. "They're coming." Father O'Reilly closed his eyes briefly, crossing himself. "Then there's hope yet. Spread the word carefully. Tell only those you trust completely." The news traveled in whispers, behind closed doors, in the shadowy corners of the mine shafts, through meaningful glances exchanged at the general store. 3 legendary lawmen were coming to free Red Rock. Some scoffed, having long ago surrendered to despair. Others dared to hope, recalling stories of the 3 marshals who had tamed lawless territories when no one else could. That evening, the Red Rock Saloon hummed with subdued conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Sheriff Slade occupied his usual table in the corner, from which he could observe the entire room. He signaled the nervous bartender. "Eddie, get over here." The bartender approached, wiping his hands on a soiled apron. "Yes, Sheriff?" Slade leaned forward, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm hearing rumors, people talking about salvation coming. Have you heard anything like that?" Eddie's forehead beaded with sweat. No, sir. Just the usual complaints about work and weather." Slade studied him, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes couldn't quite meet Slade's. Without warning, he grabbed Eddie's wrist, slamming it onto the table. "Lying to an officer of the law is a serious offense, Eddie." "I swear, Sheriff, I haven't heard anything specific," Eddie gasped. "Just people saying things might change soon. That's all." Slade released him with a shove. "Virgil," he called to Cobb, who materialized from the shadows. "Double the night patrols. Anyone on the streets after sunset gets questioned. Anyone who can't give a good reason for being out gets a night in the cell to think about their poor choices." Cobb's thin lips twisted into something approximating a smile. "With pleasure, Sheriff." As Slade watched the terrified bartender retreat, a flicker of unease settled in his gut. He'd built his kingdom through careful manipulation and strategic violence. He'd eliminated threats before they materialized. But something felt different this time, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, promising lightning and thunder that would shake the very foundations of Red Rock. Outside, the wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning through the streets. In the distance, 3 riders approached, moving steadily toward a town desperately awaiting salvation. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when they appeared. 3 silhouettes on the horizon, approaching slowly but with unmistakable purpose. Red Rock's early risers stopped in their tracks, conversations dying mid-sentence as all eyes turned toward the newcomers. Word spread quickly, and by the time the riders reached Main Street, the boardwalks were lined with curious, hopeful, and fearful faces. Elias Shaw led the procession, sitting tall in his saddle despite his years. His duster was dusty from the trail, but the gun on his hip gleamed with meticulous care. Jonah Kane rode to his right, his black coat and hat marking him immediately as the preacher. His Bible was secured in his saddlebag, but his right hand rested near his holster, ready for earthly judgment if necessary. Harlan Grady brought up the rear, his keen eyes scanning every window, alley, and rooftop as they advanced into what might as well have been enemy territory. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the stares. They simply rode straight to the livery stable, dismounted, and paid the wide-eyed stable boy to tend their horses. "Those are the men Martha spoke of," one miner whispered to another. "Older than I expected," came the doubtful reply. A deputy named Fletcher burst into the sheriff's office, finding Slade at his desk counting the previous day's collections. "Sheriff, 3 strangers just rode in. They look like—" "I don't care what they look like," Slade interrupted, not bothering to look up. "New arrivals mean new taxes. Find out if they're staying and how much money they're carrying." Fletcher shifted nervously. "One of them's wearing a marshal's coat, sir." Slade's hands froze mid-count. His eyes slowly lifted to meet Fletcher's. "A marshal? Here? There's been no communication from the territorial office. Former marshal, from the looks of it, and he's not alone." Before Slade could respond, the office door swung open. Elias Shaw stood in the doorway alone, his weathered face impassive. Slade's deputies reached for their weapons, but Shaw didn't even flinch. "Been a long time, Malachai," Shaw said, his voice as dry as the desert itself. Slade leaned back in his chair, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Shaw, heard you were growing turnips or some such nonsense these days." "Corn, mostly," Shaw replied, stepping fully into the office and closing the door behind him. He glanced around, taking in the opulent furnishings that seemed out of place in a frontier sheriff's office. "You've done well for yourself. Crime must pay better than I remember." The deputies looked to Slade, awaiting instructions, but the sheriff waved them down. "Just a friendly visit from an old acquaintance, boys. Give us a minute." When they were alone, Slade's false smile vanished. "What do you want, Shaw?" "I want you to pack your things, take your men, and ride out of Red Rock by sundown." Shaw's tone was conversational, as if suggesting nothing more consequential than a change in the weather. Slade laughed, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Or what? You'll arrest me? Your badge doesn't shine anymore, old man." "This isn't about badges," Shaw replied. "It's about justice. It's coming for you, Malachai. Tonight, tomorrow, or next week, but it's coming." Slade stood slowly, his hand drifting toward the gun on his desk. "Is that so? And I suppose you're bringing it, along with the preacher and that half-breed tracker I spotted with you? 3 washed-up has-beens against me and 20 loyal men?" Shaw turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Your arithmetic's off. It's not just us 3. It's every person in this town you've beaten, robbed, and terrorized. They just don't know it yet." Later that evening, as the 3 former marshals ate quietly in the town's only restaurant, 5 of Slade's deputies entered, clearly looking for trouble. "Sheriff says your kind ain't welcome here," the largest deputy announced loudly. "Suggests you boys finish your meal and move along." Kane set down his fork with deliberate care. "We haven't finished discussing business with the good people of Red Rock." What happened next would be retold in whispers throughout the town within hours. The ensuing bar fight was brief, surgical, and decisive. Not a single shot was fired, yet all 5 deputies left on their backs, carried out by townspeople who had watched in stunned silence as 3 aging lawmen dismantled Slade's enforcers with methodical efficiency. As night fell, Red Rock buzzed with cautious excitement. Some believed salvation had finally arrived. Others feared the retribution that would surely follow. All wondered if these 3 men, legends though they might be, truly had what it would take to free them from Sheriff Slade's iron grip. Dawn broke over Red Rock, revealing a town holding its collective breath. The 3 lawmen were already moving, having risen before first light. Shaw studied the layout of Slade's office from across the street, mentally noting entry points and lines of sight. Kane walked the town's perimeter, gauging distances and identifying potential strongholds. Grady vanished into the surrounding hills, leaving behind tracks only he could follow back. By midday, they regrouped at Father O'Reilly's church. The old priest had spread a hand-drawn map of the town across his simple altar. "Slade's men patrol in pairs," Shaw observed, tracing routes with his fingertip. "Predictable patterns, changing shifts at noon and midnight." Kane nodded. "He's keeping most of his force close to the office and the bank. Smart, but it leaves the outskirts vulnerable." "Found his weapons cache," Grady contributed, speaking for the first time since their arrival. "Old mine entrance, half-mile east, poorly guarded." Their strategy session was interrupted by a tentative knock. Father O'Reilly opened the door to reveal Jesse Colton, a young miner with coal dust permanently embedded in his knuckles, and behind him, Sarah Donovan, a widow who'd lost her husband to a suspicious mining accident after he'd spoken against Slade. "We want to help," Jesse said simply, his voice surprisingly steady for someone so clearly terrified. By sunset, a dozen townspeople had joined their cause, each bringing crucial information. The widow Donovan had mapped the patrol routes from her window overlooking the main street. Jesse knew the mines like the back of his hand, offering hidden paths through the mountains to approach undetected. Under cover of darkness, Kane slipped toward the weapons cache, a torch and Bible his only companions. The guards never saw him coming. One moment standing watch, the next unconscious and bound. As flames consumed Slade's ammunition supply, Kane whispered a prayer that sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. Meanwhile, Grady intercepted a stagecoach carrying mining payroll destined for Slade's pockets. The driver, all too happy to reroute the money back to its rightful owners, provided intelligence about Slade's connections in neighboring towns. Word of these strikes spread through Red Rock like wildfire. Some citizens stood straighter, daring to meet the gaze of passing deputies. Others locked their doors, fearing what would come next. They didn't wait long. Shortly before midnight, Virgil Cobb led a dozen men through town, dragging people from their homes, anyone suspected of aiding the lawmen. Men, women, even teenagers were marched to the jail at gunpoint. "By order of Sheriff Slade," Cobb announced to the terrified crowd, "anyone harboring criminals will be treated as criminals themselves." From the shadows, the three marshals watched, their faces grim. The trap was set, but Slade had just raised the stakes. The night erupted in chaos as Slade's retribution blazed through Red Rock. Torches illuminated the main street with an angry orange glow as deputies dragged screaming townspeople from their homes. A shopkeeper who'd sheltered Kane found his store in flames, the blaze leaping hungrily toward neighboring buildings. Women clutched children to their chests as masked men ransacked their homes, searching for any sign of the lawmen or those who aided them. Sheriff Slade watched from the porch of his office, a thin smile playing across his lips as he savored the fear permeating the night air. Beside him, Virgil Cobb stood at attention, awaiting further orders. "Make an example of the blacksmith's apprentice," Slade ordered, gesturing toward the jail where the young man had been beaten unconscious. "Hang him at dawn. Let them see what becomes of those who defy me." Inside the crowded jailhouse, 20 townspeople huddled together, their faces bruised and bloodied. Among them was Martha Ellis, who had barely made it back to town before Slade's men swept through. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, praying that her sacrifice would not be in vain. But salvation was closer than any of them realized. On the ridge overlooking town, Shaw surveyed the destruction through a spyglass, his jaw tightening with each new atrocity. Beside him, Kane loaded his peacemaker with methodical precision. "It's time," Shaw said simply. They moved like ghosts in the darkness, communicating with hand signals honed through years of working together. Grady disabled the rear guards with silent efficiency, leaving them bound and gagged in an alley. Kane positioned himself on the roof of the general store, providing cover as Shaw approached the jailhouse from the shadows. The jail guard never saw the blow that knocked him unconscious. Keys in hand, Shaw unlocked the cells, pressing a finger to his lips as the prisoners blinked in disbelief. "Stay low, move fast, head for the church," he whispered. "Father O'Reilly is waiting." Outside, a shot rang out. Kane signaled that they'd been spotted. The night erupted in gunfire as Slade's men scrambled to respond to the jailbreak. Shaw led the escaping townspeople through back streets, while Grady provided covering fire from the shadows. Enraged by this defiance, Slade stormed into the street, his face contorted with fury as he watched his prisoners vanish into the night. He grabbed the nearest deputy, a young man named Collins who had failed to raise the alarm in time. "You let this happen," Slade snarled, drawing his pistol. "Sheriff, please, I didn't—" Collins never finished his plea. Slade's bullet caught him square in the chest, dropping him to the dirt. "Anyone else want to disappoint me tonight?" Slade roared, waving his smoking gun at his remaining men. By dawn, an uneasy quiet had settled over Red Rock. The escaped prisoners huddled in the church basement, tended by Father O'Reilly and the widow Donovan. Slade's men conducted a house-by-house search, but found nothing. On Slade's desk, a single piece of paper appeared as if by magic. Justice is coming. The church basement had transformed overnight into a resistance headquarters. Maps and diagrams covered the walls, while townspeople who had never held weapons found themselves learning to load and aim rifles under Kane's stern guidance. The preacher moved among them, his deep voice alternating between prayer and instruction. "Aim true, but remember why we fight," he told a trembling shopkeeper. "Not for vengeance, but for justice." In the corner, Shaw and Grady huddled with Jesse and the other miners, planning escape routes should their stand fail. They marked hidden mine entrances and hillside paths, contingencies in case the worst came to pass. "You'll have one chance," Shaw explained, his finger tracing the main street on a crude map. "When the shooting starts, Slade will expect us to retreat. Instead, we push forward, driving them back toward the sheriff's office." Sarah Donovan distributed ammunition, her face set with determination. "My Henry's watching from above," she said softly. "Today, I make him proud." Outside, Red Rock had become a ghost town. Shops remained closed, windows shuttered. Slade's men patrolled in groups of 4 now, jumpy and trigger-happy after the night's events. From his office, Slade dispatched riders to nearby settlements, calling in favors and hiring additional guns for what he knew would be a decisive confrontation. "I want 20 men ready by sundown," he ordered Cobb. "Station sharpshooters on the rooftops. Anyone who steps into the street without my permission gets shot on sight." Cobb nodded, but hesitation flickered across his gaunt face. "Sheriff, maybe we should consider moving on. These marshals have the town behind them now." Slade's hand moved faster than a striking snake, his pistol barrel pressing against Cobb's temple. "Are you losing your nerve, Virgil? After everything we've built here?" "No, sir," Cobb whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Good, because I didn't come this far to run from 3 ancient lawmen playing hero." As dusk approached, the tension grew unbearable. The church bell tolled 6 times, the signal for all loyal townspeople to retreat to their homes. The streets emptied save for Slade's men taking positions behind barricades and water troughs. In the gathering darkness, none of them noticed Thomas Reed, the saloon piano player, slipping between buildings toward the church. His face was ashen, his hands trembling as Father O'Reilly ushered him inside. "Slade knows you're here," Reed blurted when brought before Shaw. "He's gathered 20 men, maybe more. They're planning to burn the church at dawn with everyone inside." A heavy silence fell over the room. Martha Ellis was the first to speak. "How does Slade know our plans, Thomas?" Reed's eyes darted nervously. I had to tell him. He has my daughter." Shaw exchanged glances with Kane and Grady. They'd anticipated a trap, but not betrayal. "Dawn it is, then," Shaw said quietly. "But we won't be the ones burning." First light crept over the eastern ridge, painting Red Rock's weathered buildings in soft gold. The town remained eerily quiet, windows shuttered, doors barred, streets empty, save for Slade's men positioned strategically behind makeshift barricades. Slade himself stood on the sheriff's office porch, Winchester rifle cradled in his arms, watching the church with predatory intensity. "Light it up," he ordered, gesturing to a deputy carrying a torch. The man hesitated, glancing at the church where he'd attended services his entire life. "Sir, there are women and children." "Now!" Slade barked, raising his rifle. Before the deputy could move, a tremendous explosion rocked the north end of town. Smoke billowed from where Slade's men had established their defensive line. Seconds later, another blast tore through the stables where reinforcements waited with their horses. Grady's dynamite had found its mark. In the sudden confusion, the church doors burst open. But instead of panicked townspeople, armed miners poured out, firing in disciplined volleys just as Kane had taught them. Behind them came shopkeepers, ranchers, and even the old blacksmith, wielding weapons with grim determination. "They're flanking us!" a deputy shouted as gunfire erupted from the alleyways. Shaw emerged from the gunsmith's shop directly across from Slade, 2 revolvers drawn. Their eyes met across the chaos. Decades of history compressed into a single moment of recognition. Shaw fired first, his bullet splintering the porch post beside Slade's head. The battle descended into brutal, close-quarters combat. Kane held the town square, his back against the water trough, picking off deputies with methodical precision. Each shot was followed by a whispered prayer, not for forgiveness, but for justice. Grady moved like a shadow across the rooftops, his rifle cracking with deadly accuracy whenever Slade's reinforcements attempted to gain higher ground. 3 men fell to his bullets before they even realized where the shots were coming from. Young Jesse Colton led a group of miners in a charge against the jail, determined to secure it before Slade's men could use it as a fallback position. Bullets tore through his sleeve and hat, but the young man pressed forward, inspired by the courage of the 3 lawmen who had taught him that some things were worth dying for. The tide turned when Virgil Cobb fell, a bullet from Sarah Donovan's shotgun catching him square in the chest as he attempted to flank Kane's position. With Cobb down, Slade's carefully constructed hierarchy began to crumble. Deputies who had joined him for easy money rather than loyalty started to break ranks, fleeing toward the hills. Slade, seeing his control evaporating, made his decision. He fired 3 quick shots into the melee, then ducked through the sheriff's office and out the back door. Mounting the fastest horse in his stable, he spurred it toward the canyon lands to the west. Shaw spotted his escape and shouted to Grady, who was already moving, sliding down from the roof and racing toward his waiting horse. The tracker paused only long enough to meet Shaw's gaze, a wordless promise to find their quarry. The battle for Red Rock wasn't over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Harlan Grady's mount thundered across the desert floor, following a trail only he could see. Disturbed pebbles, bent sagebrush, a fresh hoofprint in a patch of sand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the terrain as Grady tracked Slade deeper into the maze-like canyon lands west of Red Rock. Behind him rode Shaw and Kane, trusting their companion's legendary tracking skills. Slade had a head start, but panic made him careless. Where once he might have covered his tracks or laid false trails, now he simply rode hard, desperate to put distance between himself and justice. His horse, a magnificent black stallion stolen from a rancher who'd refused to pay taxes, was beginning to foam at the mouth, pushed beyond endurance.
"He's heading for Desolation Canyon,"
Grady called back, pointing toward a narrow gap between towering red rock formations.
"Probably has a hideout there."
Shaw nodded grimly. Or friends. The Kirby gang was rumored to hole up in these parts. The three lawmen slowed their approach as the canyon walls rose around them, creating perfect positions for ambush. Kane unslung his rifle, scanning the ridge lines for movement, while Grady studied the ground. "Dismounted here," he murmured, swinging down from his horse. "Tracks lead into that old mine entrance." The abandoned silver mine gaped like an open wound in the canyon wall. Rotting support beams framed the dark opening, and rusty tracks for ore carts disappeared into the blackness. The three men approached cautiously, guns drawn.
"Malachai!"
Shaw called, his voice echoing off the stone walls.
"There's nowhere left to run. Come out and face what's coming to you."
Silence answered him, broken only by the soft whistle of wind through the canyon. Then, from deep within the mine, came Slade's voice, strained but defiant.
"You should have stayed with your turnips, Shaw. You're too old for this game."
A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off stone inches from Kane's head. The preacher didn't flinch, his eyes narrowing as he pinpointed the shooter's location.
"Cover me,"
Shaw whispered, then darted toward the mine entrance, using abandoned mining equipment for shelter. Kane provided the requested cover, firing methodically into the darkness, while Grady circled around, finding a narrow trail that led to an upper entrance further along the canyon wall. Inside the mine, Shaw moved carefully, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of blasting powder. He could hear Slade retreating deeper into the tunnel, occasional shots fired blindly to keep pursuit at bay.
"Was it worth it, Malachai?"
Shaw called, ducking as another bullet whined past.
"All those people you hurt, the lives you destroyed, for what? Money? Power over a dusty mining town?"
"It was never about the money," Slade's voice echoed from the darkness. "It was about proving I could take what you swore to protect. Every time I beat one of those miners, I was beating you, Shaw." The confession hung in the stale air as Shaw rounded a corner, finally catching sight of his quarry. Slade stood at the end of the tunnel, trapped against a collapsed section, his gun aimed squarely at Shaw's chest. "Looks like we've come to the end of the line," Shaw said quietly. Slade's smile was a death's head grin. "Only for one of us, old man." The final confrontation in the mine was swift and decisive. Shaw's bullet found Slade's chest, ending his reign with a whimper rather than the blaze of glory he might have imagined. As life drained from the corrupt sheriff, Kane offered a final chance at redemption, only to be met with defiant last words. Tell Red Rock they were never free, just changed masters. The three lawmen returned to town carrying Slade's body, visible proof that justice had finally caught up with the man who had terrorized Red Rock for so long. Below them, townspeople were already clearing barricades and tending to the wounded, while the church bell tolled for those lost in the struggle. Father O'Reilly met them at the town's edge. "It's done then?" Shaw nodded once, dismounting stiffly. "It's done." The following morning, a solemn procession made its way to the hillside cemetery. 8 coffins carried those who had fallen fighting for their town's freedom. Cain stood before the gathered crowd, his Bible open as he spoke of sacrifice and courage. These men and women gave their lives not just for their own freedom, but for generations to come. They remind us that tyranny prospers when good people remain silent. As the last prayer was spoken and earth fell upon the coffins, Sarah Donovan approached the 3 lawmen. "What happens now?" she asked. "Slade is gone, but his kind always returns unless something changes." Shaw exchanged glances with his companions. They had done what they came to do. The badge they once carried now belonged to others.
"That's for Red Rock to decide," Shaw replied. "Every town must find its own path to justice."
Jesse Colton stepped forward, his young face determined despite his bandaged head. "Then help us find ours before you go." 5 years after Sheriff Slade's fall, Red Rock had transformed. No longer a town living in fear, it had become a thriving community where miners received fair pay and merchants prospered without extortion. The scars remained. Samuel Wilson's damaged arm never fully healed, and the graves on the hillside stood as silent reminders of the price of freedom. But the wounds had closed. Around campfires throughout the Arizona Territory, the tale of the 3 legendary lawmen who freed Red Rock from tyranny grew with each telling. Some said Shaw had faced down 20 men alone. Others claimed Cain could stop bullets with Bible verses, and a few insisted Grady could track a ghost across bare stone. In the Red Rock Saloon, now owned by Martha Ellis, a faded photograph hung behind the bar. 3 stern-faced men standing before the church, their eyes holding the steady gaze of men who had seen both darkness and light in this world and chosen to stand for the latter. Jesse Colton, now wearing the sheriff's badge, polished it each morning with the same care he'd once shown his mining tools. The lessons Shaw and the others had taught him during those few transformative days guided his every decision. Justice tempered with mercy, strength without tyranny, vigilance without paranoia.
"Sheriff Colton,"
a young deputy called, entering the office.
"Got a report of trouble brewing over Copper Creek. Sounds like someone's trying to run a scheme like Slade did here."
Jesse nodded, reaching for his hat. "Send word to Sheriff Donovan in Redemption. She'll want to help." Sarah Donovan had taken the badge in the neighboring town, continuing the legacy the 3 lawmen had begun. Far away, deep in the Superstition Mountains, 3 aged figures sat before a campfire. They rarely rode together anymore, each having found their own measure of peace. Shaw with his cornfields, Cain with a small desert congregation, Grady with his solitary existence among the canyons. But once a year, they gathered to remember what they had accomplished and to honor those who had fallen. "To Red Rock," Shaw said, raising a tin cup. "To justice," added Cain. Grady, a man of few words, simply nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Flames that, like the legend of their deeds, would burn bright for generations to come. If you thought this was crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.